You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. Recent research published by the National Union of Students has revealed that 50% of students identified with prevailing sexism, a culture of harassment, and ladism at their university. The report, That's What She Said, Women Students' Experiences of Lad Culture in Higher Education, has defined lad culture as a group or pack mentality residing in activities such as sport and heavy alcohol consumption and banter, which was often sexist, misogynist and homophobic. Sexual harassment and violence were also very much related to so-called lad culture, which included verbal harassment as well as physical harassment and sexual molestation. And groping in nightclubs was viewed by some who took part in the survey as part of a normal night out. In a subsequent letter to Women's Minister Jo Swinson, the NUS Women's Officer Kelley wrote that the study found a worrying prevalence of lad culture, and the report will make uncomfortable reading for many of us, NUS and students' unions included. When it comes to our own responsibilities, lad culture is a problem that needs to be addressed urgently. So how did lad culture become the norm in UK universities, and where did it come from? I'm joined by Nikki Hodgson, sex columnist for Men's Health magazine, director of the Ethical Porn Partnership and author of Bound to You. Martin Daubney, journalist, broadcaster and formerly the longest-serving editor of Lads Mag Loaded. And Oliver Cox, historian investigating masculinity in the 21st century through the ages and a competing Ironman. So really, to start things off, I mean, what sort of debate do we need to have about ladism? Is there a crisis of male identity in the UK? Oliver, I'll start with you.
I think the important thing is actually we need to look at this in historical perspective, which I would say as a historian, but the notion of what gives men worth in the eyes of their contemporaries, I think is something that's really, really important. And I think you see it, I see it quite a lot in the gym. When you get in the way in which male posturing is sort of geared towards heavyweights, sort of that sort of really gruff, aggressive sort of interaction in the gym. Whereas I'm sort of there, because my sport is Ironman triathlon, so for me it's about being small and light rather than like a big bruiser. And so that means in the eyes of the majority of blokes there, I don't have worth because I'm not physically big, and I think that's something that's very interesting, is that sort of, that equation of sort of physicality with, masculinity.
And then the kind of transference of that physicality into what is then verbally translated in how they behave at universities. Nikki Hodgson, then, crisis of masculinity?
Well, we've had, we've had many crises of masculinity over the past century. I think Oliver would attest to that. And it's a debate I've been working between here and America, and it's certainly a debate that wages large over there. I think we're at a sort of watershed moment, because I think the debate around what makes a woman and the women's movement has come to a point where people have interrogated it enough to sort of start to shift their view onto men and say, well, if we're going to change, we need men to change too. And at the same time, we know that education is sort of favouring women at the minute, or women are doing better out of it. Mental health issues really affect men, particularly young men. And we still haven't quite come to terms with how we deal with these social problems, because we've been for so long focused on women's inequality. And I think that's right that we have. And there's still so many more things to do on that. But I think because of that, men have been sort of slightly... they've been blocked out of the debate on what makes for a good man. And we've been so ready to criticise men for their behaviour towards women. We have never stopped to think, well, what example can we set for men, or what role models can we give to men to encourage them to be better, rather than just slating them for their sexist behaviour or, their ineffectual behaviour.
So the cost of fighting for equality for women has seen that there's an ignorance of the social problems that men face, and that might be the mental health problems that they don't want to talk about as readily.
Yeah, it's actually highlighting them. I think that's one of the beauties of feminism, actually, is that if you're talking about equality, then you have to start eventually looking at it across the board, how it affects every single person. And eventually you will start to see how men are unequal in some ways.
Martin, you agreed with the point there.
Well, I disagree with some of that too. I fundamentally disagree that there's a crisis of masculinity. I think we're told it so often by aggressive feminists, actually, that some men are believing that. I was on the committee at the Being a Man Festival recently, where we explored, what is it to be a man these days? How is masculinity defined? And, there is no one-fit solution now. No, there's no off-the-peg way of being a man. There was for my father's generation. We were breadwinners. No, but now we're stay-at-home dads. We work part-time. We're juggling the life balance too and finding it difficult. Men are having to adjust, to like millennia of patriarchal, responsibilities and privileges in the space of one generation, and men are finding it tough to adapt. Talking about lad culture, I find it, fascinating that we're talking about a resurgence of it, because, the critics of lad culture have been telling me for the last decade that it's dying out, because men are stopping buying men's magazines. QED lad culture's dead, and now we're being told it's back. It's conveniently back when it's proving a point of misogyny. And I think what we're getting now is this kind of hyena pack-like mentality on websites such as Everyday Sexism, which are quite rightly pointing out some nasty behaviour by some men, a minority of men. On the other hand, though, there is this kind of outing of bad behaviour across the board, which I think exacerbates male behaviour. It makes us feel, well, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. Men are confused about how to behave, because if we behave chivalrously in an old-fashioned way of being courteous towards women, we're scared it's going to come across as patronising. Men are terrified of going on this constant thin ice of what's allowable in the kind of modern male-female interface. As a result, we're seeing more anonymous hatred on the internet. We're seeing grotesque trolling. And I hasten to add, this is not unique to masculine behaviour. There are lots and lots of incidents of women being hideous on the internet too. Let's stop kicking the hell out of lads. This affects everybody.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London, where I'm hosting a discussion on ladism. And I'm joined by Nikki Hodgson, sex columnist for Men's Health, director of the Ethical Porn Partnership, and author of Bound to You. I'm also joined by Martin Daubney, journalist, broadcaster, and once the longest-serving editor of Lads Mag Loaded, and Oliver Cox, who's an Ironman and historian, investigating masculinity in the 21st century through the ages. Oliver, I mean, the no crisis of male identity, you suggest that there's been one throughout the ages. Would you agree with Martin there that to look at, and Nikki as well, really, to look at equality across the board, we have to take into consideration men and women, and going on what Martin's saying, by highlighting the issues of lad culture and what's going on in universities, does this make the situation worse, and does this prevent men having a necessary role model that they could do with?
I think the difficulty is with the pack mentality, and I think it responds to Martin's point in one way, which is that these guys by themselves probably aren't bad blokes. Yeah. I would imagine. I think a good example is I was on the train back from Manchester this weekend, and it was sort of kicking out time of some sort of second division team had lost. The guys on the train were pretty gutted. 8 of them, single woman, travelling by herself in the quiet carriage. She'd asked one of them to just not make a phone call, which seemed reasonable enough in the quiet carriage. And I think had that bloke been travelling by himself, no issue. He'd have probably said, "Oh yeah, sorry." 7 other guys in the room, in the carriage, and it meant that for the rest of the journey, she was subjected to sort of pretty low-level sexist banter, which continued for sort of good 2-3 hours until actually, I sort of stood up and I said, "Hey, guys, 8 of you, 1 of her. I mean, it's not really. Are you being big lads here? It's that pack mentality that I think is difficult." And the other thing, going back to Martin's point, is like when did lads become a thing? When was ladism invented? That's something I'm not sure about. Is it just a sort of late 20th century phenomenon, or have we been sort of dealing with lads throughout?
But then, Martin, you're recognised as the longest serving editor of Lads Mag Loaded. Yeah. Ladism sort of came to prominence under your watch.
Ladism became another convenient coat peg, to put behaviour on. It was of its time. We're talking about the mid-1990s. Loaded launched in 1994. In actual fact, ladism was a backlash back to the new men, the way we were told we ought to behave. And we were told we ought to behave this way in the liberal left-wing press. You know, men's magazines were an arid sort of moonscape of enjoyment. I mean, we were told we need to wear papooses. You know, we should be kind of buying Parma ham, and it was before metrosexuality was even coined as a phrase. But it was a desperately depressing prospect. We didn't want it. Ladism was a kickback against that. Don't tell us how to behave. Now, when it first started out, everybody wanted to be a lad. You know, Tony Blair invited Noel Gallagher into number 10 Downing Street in that tremendous election of '97, which defined that era, this new beginning of cool Britannia. And then quite quickly, it was kind of taken in by the masses, and of course it has its unsavoury elements. And now it's a badge of shame. No, ladism, I think it's fair to say, is something that's viewed through an extremely negative prism, but it really undefines behaviour that was always there. I mean, if you go back, to the days of Attila the Hun, probably not the best example, but if you go back historically, men have always been men. That's not to say that crass and sexist behaviour on train carriages, like you mentioned, Oliver, is anyway acceptable. That's not manly behaviour. That's maggot behaviour. That isn't how we should behave. But not all men are like that. And what irks me is the fact that we're all damned by a few sort of out there incidents. There are some good guys too.
Are we following in the footsteps of what's happening on American campuses? Is this where the predatory pack mentality, the banter, the sort of roles, that very segregated roles of women and men and girls and boys? You work in America, Nikki.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I've been appalled by the sexism in America, and I've been in California, which I would have considered to be a liberal state, and I've been in San Francisco, for heaven's sake, and I have been amazed at the level of street harassment. And I don't just mean people saying, oh, you look good today, which I don't personally have a problem with. I mean people trailing you on the street, people trying to grope you in the street. Where I was living in Berkeley, it's basically frat town, and watching what would happen on a football weekend was just atrocious. I mean, just in terms of like low-level human behaviour, not even male behaviour, just, really, is that how you want to kind of, waste your life, sort of, was kind of my feeling. But I think what America very much has done is that it's kind of exported that sort of frat culture as something to be kind of laughed about and sort of taken part in,
like the films.
And I think it's all well and good when it's kind of humorous, but the internet is certainly the place where it becomes very dark often. And message boards, the way that, for example, there was a young female college student who outed herself. Well, she didn't out herself initially. She was outed as a porn star last week at Duke University, and I wrote a piece defending her because the level of slut-shaming and humiliation she received from these boys that were perfectly happy to buy the clips she was in, she was the one that was punished for basically exploring and sort of promoting her sexuality, which they wanted to be part of, but they didn't really know how to, they couldn't do anything else but condemn her for basically kind of exposing their shame and their conflict about their own sexuality. And what I've really found from America is that America is deeply conflicted about sex, far more than Britain is, far more than Europe is. And the kind of underlying purity messages in conflict with this kind of, the country that produces and consumes the most porn in the world creates this real conflict, especially for the young men who are basically said, oh, here are all these very available women, but you mustn't treat the women in your college like that. I remember, for example, an American ex of mine telling me a story about how when he was in a frat, he lived in a frat house, he had found out, he was dating this girl, and he found out from one of his friends, or overheard him say, oh, has she given you head yet? She gives great head. And he then dumped her, because he couldn't cope with the fact that other people knew what she was like in bed. And that just really epitomised to me that double bind of being a sexual female and a male that appreciates or wants to kind of consume female sexuality in American culture, the way that kind of Americans are encouraged to do, and yet is completely ashamed of it and wants to slut shame the person that provides it for you. And I think we're seeing more of that here for sure. I mean, it's interesting thinking about sexism on the internet, actually, because when I go on television, I get a huge amount of sexist commentary thrown back at me. And it's never in relation to what I'm doing. So I go on Sky News and talk about the Ukraine. And then if I make a mistake, I'm met with, sexist commentary, and it's like, no, I made a factual error, and you can call me a bad journalist, but it's not because I've got blonde hair,
Yeah, but I get that too on Sky News, but it's not called sexism. They just call me names. And like, what is sexism? Where does sexism begin, and where does just stupid behaviour begin?
Well, that's what we're going back to the point that you made initially. It's ladism, or is this behaviour? People write.
Yeah, I write
and ask questions on sexual health. No,
I actually have a sort of what I consider to be a really important job, because what I try and do is break down my feminist beliefs and my sort of equalitist beliefs, and I like to be a mediator between men and women. I'm sort of trying to kind of transmute those ideas to a sort of populist male audience. There's 500,000 readers a month of Men's Health, so it's actually a really, really important job. But what I'm trying to do is write on their terms and communicate with them in a way they're going to understand. What really annoys me about the kind of everyday sexism movement and the kind of feminist debate around lad culture is that they go in there and they tell them how wrong they are, and it's overly instructional, and it doesn't work with them, it doesn't communicate with them about, because, not everything that men think about sex or drinking or partying is wrong. Some of it's just entertainment, some of it's just fun. And I think there's a real class element to this, which we haven't touched upon yet. Yeah. Some of the times I've been sexually assaulted in my life were by men of what I would consider to be middle or upper class standing. I was sexually harassed by a former boss who had a huge amount of power over me. Now, he routinely went on about the state of masculinity, the state of these horrible working class lads. But he was far more culpable of genuine sexism, in my opinion. And this ladism debate actually protects those kinds of men from being picked up a lot of the time.
Yeah, because it focuses on the packs and those being reported and seen on the internet.
On the masses, it's so easy to jump on the football terraces.
Well, it's actually white working class males are incredibly put upon and sort of stigmatised for ladism. Sorry, you.
No, I was just going to say it's that equation between ladism and hooliganism. Yeah. Seems to be we seem to be coming up against again and again here, which is that a lad is a hooligan. That seems to be the binary that we're operating on here, and I don't know how true that is, as Martin's been saying.
But Martin's saying ladism, hooliganism is a sort of behavioural style, not something to necessarily pigeonhole men with.
Yeah, and I think people, it's a coat that we put on and take off, from time to time too. As you said, when men are around other men, they behave very differently to when they're around females. And I hasten to add again, not always badly. At the Being a Man Festival recently, it was encouraging men to communicate in new ways just to men. And what we find quite often is that when we get to real, pure men-only environments, such as in Afghanistan on the front line, men aren't laddie. Men are actually incredibly gay. And that was told to me by a war photographer. Yeah. That was told to me by a war photographer who'd lost both legs and an arm, who spends a lot of time in Basra, because men are incredibly emotional, incredibly open. They're crying because their friends died yesterday, and they are behaving in a way that you would never associate with squaddies who are about to die on the front line. Not all men in men-only environments are scum.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London, with me, Juliet Spare. To talk about so-called ladism, I'm joined by Nikki Hodgson, sex columnist for Men's Health magazine, director of the Ethical Porn Partnership and author of Bound to You. I'm also joined by Martin Daubney, who's a journalist, broadcaster and was once the longest-serving editor of so-called lads mag, Loaded. And Oliver Cox, who's a historian and accomplished Ironman, who investigates masculinity in the 21st century. You've all really criticised the movement to fight lad culture, but I gather from what you're all saying, it really ignores many of the sort of cultural issues and behavioural issues that we really should focus on. And there was an article I read from a student who wrote for Durham University's newspaper, which he said really, the debate really needs to change, and we should try and understand rather than condone this. From a student in Durham.
Absolutely.
Because what's happening now is that the debate does in no way engages young men. Exactly. It just attacks them. Exactly. And guess what? If you're attacked, you switch off.
Yeah. It's what you call stereotype threat in... that's the kind of jargon for it. It's the idea that if you're met with how poorly you behave, you'll often kind of recapitulate that behaviour in defence of yourself. And that's what, that's kind of the real problem I'm coming up against with this column that I'm writing, that actually men really want my advice. I get so many personal emails and tweets and emails saying, oh, please, I really don't know what to do about this situation. But they can't say that in front of one another. And it's really interesting how when I get the commission from the magazine itself, it's always framed in, here's the action you need to take, here's the power you need to hold, instead of, actually, I'm vulnerable and I don't know how to relate to women, and please, can you give me some advice? And actually, I've got feelings too, All that stuff is neglected.
So at Oxford, there's a new thing called Good Lad, which is where, it's a series of essentially training events telling you how to be a good bloke. But one of the problems with that is it's often inflicted as a sort of punishment after, one of the rugby teams has gone out and done something slightly stupid. And it's a problem, and that's the problem, is that it shouldn't be, it goes back to that top-down thing. If it's seen as a punishment, you have to go on a Good Lad workshop. You're not going to take it seriously. But it's that there's an effort, sort of certainly, to use like postgraduate students as a good example of maybe trying to provide some sort of male role models. Whether we're succeeding, I don't know.
But in any way, though, Martin, just as a former editor of a lads mag, is there any culpability or any responsibility that you have for this sort of behavioural cycle that has continued and is now
it's a bit like it's a bit like saying that pub owners are responsible for the most extreme violence and the most idiotic drunks on the streets. Just because a fraction of men behave idiotically, should we close the pubs? Just because a fraction of men are repugnant in their behaviour towards women, should we condemn them all and should we blame lad mags? It's just 2 + 2 = 5. And how often are men criticised by, man up, grow a pair? So on the one hand, we're being told, stop being so sexually aggressive and repugnant. On the other hand, we're saying, be more of a man. Having bigger testicles is better. Behaving more like a man is better. Men are just confused. We're getting bombarded with this conflicting information of how we should behave. As a consequence, we're going inwards. We're not engaging with this broader debate. So it's like, well, if we're going to be criticised for how we're going to behave, why not? It's a bit like if your girlfriend accuses you of being unfaithful when you're not. You think, well, I might as well shag around. I'm getting it in the neck. Why not just go and do it? So if all men are being condemned as behaving irresponsibly towards women, we think, well, we might as well just do it. Because we're getting accused anyway. The everyday sexism movement just drives a wedge between men and women. It doesn't talk to men. It shouts at them.
That's what goes back to your point about equality is on both sides.
But I get so much, I get into so much trouble for things I do and things I say. I was involved in a humorous piece for Vice magazine yesterday about catcalling. And the woman that wrote it was saying, in certain situations, I enjoy a catcall. And what she was really talking about, what she was separating out, was the politics of desire with her feminist politics, i.e. you can be turned on by something that doesn't match up with your feminism, but owning your desire is okay. But what happened, and I sort of kind of chipped in and I said, yeah, I think that's absolutely true, that if you get a white van man or a lad heckling you on the street, it's not sort of it's not taken... Well, it can be taken with more good grace if the man is dressed in a certain kind of suit and posturing as a kind of hip media type. And feminists just rounded on me for this because they were like, no, all street harassment is the same. And on the one hand, it is. But the reality of how desire works is that sometimes you are attracted or compelled by things that don't match up with your gender equality politics. So anyway, and this is something that men in particular are very aware of, because they are being told that their desire is wrong, continually wrong, that none of the desires they have for women are acceptable unless they're kind of rose petal covered. And, and all pornography is bad. And, all objectification is negative and no women ever enjoy it. And yet women are reading 50 Shades of Grey and getting into spanking. And now they're stuck because how do I treat this woman in bed? Because, women are fantasizing about this, but everybody in the kind of feminist circle is telling me, but it's all wrong. And so what it really comes down to is this issue of mediation and communication. What do men want? What do women want? And what can we do about it? And actually on a people level, what does one person want and what does another person want? And that stuff just isn't addressed by this kind of, this separation of ladism versus, feminism and kind of re-education projects.
In some way then, Oliver, has the history caught up with the politics of how men and women are supposed to behave and how they were portrayed as behaving?
I think the interesting thing is following on from Nikki's point, it's about trying to create a dialogue now, whereas in the past that dialogue often hasn't existed. The male identity has been created with a perception of what an ideal woman is, but there hasn't been a communication between those two things. And I think that's why we're finding it so difficult now, is that actually we're being forced to have this debate in a culture where there's so much more interaction. The speed of interaction has increased in a sense that this was, in the 18th century, it's going to take like 3 days to write a letter to someone. Here we can tweet, we can Facebook, we can do everything. So things spiral and increase in velocity, which means that we have very little time to reflect.
And the spiralling increases with the transference from America to the UK through YouTube channels, through the internet, through social media networks, on how people are behaving in certain areas and frat houses and how this is transferred over here. And then the argument continues to erupt. Do you in any way think that actually there is a place for these projects and these reports to highlight the issues that we are talking about today, even if you necessarily don't agree that the argument is going in the right direction? Yeah.
I mean, the whole premise of sort of academic research is that you have a variety of different viewpoints, and so as many people that you can get creating reports that we are discussing actively, that's a really good thing. I mean, I think that the challenge is working out how to steer the debate towards the really important aspects of it.
Well, for example, I'm really sort of frustrated about the fact that when we have a debate about rape, there are very few male voices involved in that debate, and it's left to female journalists or female journalists that commandeer it and identify as feminists to tell everybody else what we should do about rape. There's the White Ribbon Alliance that does really good work around men and sexual violence. There's Justin Hancock, who's a sex educator who runs Bish Training, which is basically a sex website for young men, primarily. It's for young people now, but he started off as a male teen sex educator. So there's clearly lots of people out there who are capable of reaching out to men and are doing great work with it. But what we really need is the kind of feminist sector to embrace them and to do more collaborative projects, and just let's have an environment where men feel they can say this stuff that's burdening them. Let's let them say that stupid thing as well without them being cut down for it. Let's let them express themselves, because once you've got all that stuff out, you can start to have dialogue, then you can start to work towards some kind of conciliation.
Finally then, from you, Oliver.
Yeah, it's about that moment where you say something that you get immediately jumped upon and you feel like an absolute idiot for it, but we need to be able to discuss the reasons why that makes me feel like an idiot, and how I can sort of learn to be a better lad, maybe. Not that I'm a lad. I don't think I'm a lad.
I don't think you're a lad.
No.
I don't think you are.
No.
Martin, final word.
I've been in this game 18 years and the song remains the same. Every report that comes out is negative thesis reinforcement, lads are bad, here we go again. And I think we're at a stage now where there is actually not a lot of real dialogue between the feminists on the one side and the lads on the other. And Twitter is making this Tourette's-like reaction in the middle, just fuel this mutual mistrust. I think it's like a really long dysfunctional marriage. We need a marriage counsellor. We've got to sit down and work this out. We're going to be here otherwise in 10 years having the same discussion.
I'd just like to say thank you to all my guests. Nikki Hodgson, sex columnist for Men's Health magazine, director of the Ethical Porn Partnership and author of Bound to You. Oliver Cox, Ironman and historian, who investigates masculinity in the 21st century and through the ages. And Martin Daubney there, a journalist, broadcaster, and was once the longest serving editor of Lads Mag Loaded.